All right, tonight we're back in the book of Revelation. This is lesson number 11. Lesson 11, we're looking at the seven churches, and we began looking at the church of Smyrna. The church at Smyrna. And remember, anybody remember what Smyrna stood for? Comes from, right, the name myrrh, M-Y-R-R-H. Myrrh, one of those strong, fragrant incense or spices, you might call it, a strong spice, and most often used in burying people for the smell. It had to be crushed in order for it to release its odor. So the idea of that is the crushing makes the smell strong and sweet. And so that has to do with a suffering church. Last week we began a detailed look at the message to the church at Smyrna. We began by looking at the city and then started observing the person of Christ. This week we observe his personal knowledge of the church and the promise to the overcomers. And I want you to see that in each church, Christ has a personal knowledge of each individual church. And I can guarantee this, he also has a personal knowledge of each and every saint of that church. And he also has a knowledge of each and every little goat that's hidden in those churches too. Christ knows his churches. Not only does he know them, he knows what they're doing, and he knows how they're doing it, why they're doing it. He knows everything. He's God, so thus he knows us, and he knows us well. But it's something that we should hang on to, is that Christ has a personal knowledge of us and our church. So when we remember that, that helps us to go through the tribulations and trials and afflictions better, knowing that Christ knows all about us and what's going on with us and how he can help us. So let's read. Let's go ahead and start back in verse 8. And let's read verses 8 through 11. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Now, nobody else can say that. Nobody else can say they're the first and the last. And nobody else can say they were dead and alive. Even Lazarus, remember, he got raised from the grave, didn't he? Where is he at now? Still back in that grave. He died afterwards. Jairus' daughter died afterwards. The widow of Nain's son died afterwards. Because that's what these bodies do. They die naturally. But Christ died and then arose. Just as those three people that he rose from the grave, rose up from that grave, he rose up not to die again, but to live eternally forevermore. So notice this, I know thy works. Underline that phrase, I know. Now remember the three attributes of God. Let me write them down over here real quick. Anybody remember the three omnis? Potent, essence, and what else? That's potent. You already said that, that's essence. One more. Present. There you go. Present. The three omnis. All right, the three omnis. Omnipotent, all powerful. Omniscient, all knowing. And omnipresent, all present. Is there anywhere in this universe where you can go where God is not? No. That question's raised in Psalm 139. If you read that, that question is raised. Is there anywhere that God cannot be or is not? No. If God is a spirit, he's everywhere. Okay? It's not like these ghost shows that you watch on TV. There's a ghost here at this place, and there's a different ghost over at this place, and there's one over here and one over there. Well, I got news for you. Those aren't ghosts. Those are demons pretending to be ghosts. But God, in his glorified Holy Spirit state, is a spirit, and he can't be bound by one place. He's everywhere. But Jesus has those same characteristics because he is God. He knows. Aren't you glad Jesus knows you? It's a personal knowledge, a personal salvation. God knows us. I know, and then he says, what? Thy what? Works. I know thy works. Now get a handle on that. God knows what you're doing. Remember, these letters are in red. If you have a red letter Bible, what's that mean? This is Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, our head, speaking to us about the church. This church in particular, Smyrna. And this church, remember, as we started when we looked at all the churches, are representative of the churches of all ages. And you will find a little bit of each church in the churches of today, the true churches of today. So here's Smyrna, and he says, I know thy works. Now notice the second part. And what? Tribulation. Now what is tribulation? Troubles, trials, afflictions. They can be spiritual. They can be physical. They can be a combination thereof. Tribulations. Now, when we think of tribulation, our minds shift automatically to that 7-year period of time that we'll be looking at in the future studies. Remember, the tribulation period is divided into 2 groups of 3.5 years. The first 3.5 is known as the tribulation. The second half is known as the Great Tribulation. You can see that in Revelation 6 and Revelation 7 for the saints that are martyred during those 7 years. All right, so you got tribulation and great tribulation. Well, what's the distinction? Well, if you look at the punishments that God, the wrath that's being poured out on the earth in the second half, you'll see a lot stronger tribulations and afflictions upon the devil and his crowd on this earth. The vials and all of those things being poured out upon the Antichrist and his kingdom. So you'll see a stronger punishment going on to the devil and his crowd. So God knows, and this tribulation, but now notice this tribulation has to deal in particular with the church. It's going through the tribulation period. Now, let me write down the names of these emperors and the year that they were in power to show you the time span of this church. All right, the first one, anybody remember Nero? Have you seen the movie on him?
You like the violin.
You like the violin and you like fire. All right? All right, write them 4 down, and then I'll write the other 4, and then I'll write the last 2. There's 10 altogether. These are the Roman emperors from the time the persecution began. All right? Nero, remember, he blamed the Christians for burning Rome. Well, it wasn't the Christians. Who was it? Nero. And he had to have some scapegoat. So he established the fact that the Christians were the ones that burned Rome. Well, that made everybody mad, and the persecution started from then on. And it lasted for 10 emperors, and we'll look at the dates that it goes to, but it goes all the way through 284 AD. Okay? So from 54 AD to 284 AD. Now think about that. That's a long time. That's a long time. And the church at Smyrna was singled out as one of those that needed to be stamped out by these emperors, and they fought this church hard. They fought to persecute each and every Christian that they could find, but in particular, the church at Smyrna is representative of all the churches during that period of time that were hunted down like dogs. They were treated like meat. They were treated like sport. They, for instance, if you've read Fox's Book of Martyrs, one of the ones that keeps sticking out in my mind is where they would take and have crosses all the way up and down the Roman highway. They had crosses on them, and they would crucify people on those crosses. But that wasn't it. That wasn't enough to be torture. They covered them with pine tar and then lit them while they were alive as candles for the Roman emperor as he drove down the highway. Now think about that. Okay? That's persecution. That's real persecution. We think we got it tough sometimes when somebody talks bad about us. These people went through the physical suffering. Everybody got these down now? Nero, Domitian, Trajan, and Hadrian. All right? The next four. I have to look at my notes because I can't remember these Romans' names. Okay, next you have Septimus in AD 193, Maximin to 235, Decius 249, and Valerian 254. Okay, Septimus, Maximin, Decius, and Valerian. 193, 235, 249, and 254. I got them? Yeah, okay. Septimus, Maximin, Decius, and Valerian. 193, 235, 249, and 254. If I got it. All right, last two. And I'll give you the one after so that you'll remember his name. All right. Now, the last two are Aurelian, 270, Diocletian, 284, and Constantine had a battle with Diocletian and beat him and took up as emperor, but he also was the one that called himself the Pontifex Maximus. Now, the Catholics try to claim that the Pope was Peter. The first Pope was Peter. This is the first Pope. He declared himself both the emperor not only of the physical state, but also the church as well. And that's why Baptists throughout history have always resisted the state-controlled church. And that's what he established, the state-controlled church. And what resulted in that was the Catholic Church. This was its roots. Not Peter and the apostles, but Constantine. Now, they'll argue with you up and down, but this is the truth. All right, everybody got them?
Do we have a date on Constantine?
He took over in 305. I didn't put the date up there. Okay, 305. That's when he conquered Rome. And he's the one that said that he had a vision. And there are two historians that wrote about it. He claimed to have seen a cross. And it said ad hoc vincit, which means in this sign conquer. Now, Constantine wasn't dumb. He knew that there were a bunch of Christians in Rome. So what he figured is that he would have more support if he put these crosses on the shields of his warriors. And that's what they did. They took up a flag, they put the crosses on their shields, and they went in and they soundly defeated Diocletian. And he took over Rome and the rule of Rome. And then what he did was, it was good. He said, now the Christians aren't going to suffer persecution. We're stopping that. But he did say, I'm going to be the ruler over the Christians, the churches. So there is the suffering church. All right, now notice it says, back in our text, it says, I know your tribulation. Now tribulation means pressure, crushing pressure. All right, now what comes the idea of crushing pressure? Anything remind you of that? Besides myrrh?
Grapes.
Yep, grapes. Anybody remember the wine press? Okay. What they would do is they would take a big vat and they put all the grapes in that. And then they would take a kind of a corkscrew thing, and on top of it would be a flat board, and they would turn that and turn it and turn it and turn it till it mashed those grapes completely flat. And the juice would be poured out in a little pipe, and that would be their grape juice. Okay? Ultimately, that would be their wine. So the idea of crushing oppression, squeezing you and squeezing you and squeezing you. And that's exactly what was going on during this time of these 10 emperors. It says he knows their tribulation. The church has always been at its best under pressure. The times of persecution, tribulation, suffering, and martyrdom has been times of victory for the church of the living God. Now think about this. Every time you see persecution through these emperors, the church would flourish. There would be more people come in, and if they were scattered, and they were scattered, by the way, even during Paul's time, they were scattered, the dispersion they called it, they would begin to take the gospel to those other places. It was kind of like God had a shotgun and shot the church out into the world. They went everywhere carrying the gospel with them. So persecution can be used by providence to help further the gospel. So if we experience persecution like this, and according to the falling away in the Old and the New Testament, there are going to be some great trials and tribulations. All right, so the great falling away, the apostasy, indicates that everybody's going to turn away from God and unto the world. But those that remain faithful will suffer persecution. In the tribulation period, there will be a bounty placed upon those that do not have the mark of the beast. If you're going to be eating, buying, selling anything in the Antichrist kingdom, you will have to have that mark that he has put on your forehead or in your right hand. Now, why does he have it in the forehead and the right hand? Remember?
Your arm, your wrist.
Some people don't have left hands. Now, some people might not have right hands. But everybody's got a forehead, if they're alive, that is. So they're going to put it in the forehand or the forehead. And what you'll do is you cannot buy, purchase, or sell without that mark. And right now, I can tell you this, I don't want to run too much into that lesson, but right now there are chips that can insert under the skin that draw electricity from your skin. Have a little lithium battery in it, and you can store all of your financial data, all your medical data in that chip. And you can also put your hand over that little scanner at the grocery store and scan and pay for your stuff that way. Your credit information, your banking account information, checking account, debit, whatever you use can be stored on that information. That's already in technology, and it's been around for about 20 years. Remember your dogs? Do y'all put chips in your dogs? Why? So you can find them. Okay? That's exactly what's going on during the Antichrist time, is so that he can track all his people, keep up with them. Not only that, but the ones that don't have these chips will be singled out and persecuted, especially. They'll be treated like meat. They'll be hunted down, they'll be sold into slavery, those kind of things, and then killed and martyred for their stand. And notice he says also the next phrase, I know thy what? Poverty. And the word used here means abject poverty, absolute and utter destitution. Not just, I ain't got no money in my pocket. It means I don't got nothing. Okay? I don't have a house on my head, don't have clothes on my back, don't have food in my belly, don't have a job, don't have nothing. Now you think about it, if you're on the run from the Romans and you're in the Roman Empire, what are you going to have? Just what's on your back, what you can carry. So, and you don't have a job. You can't have a job because the Jews or the Romans are going to give you up. So they're going to face extreme poverty. And if you read that, one of the four horsemen, he's carrying something, scales. And they said a loaf of bread during that tribulation period will cost a day's wages. All right? Back then, during the Bible times, it was a penny for a day's work. And it would cost you almost a penny for a loaf of bread. But in the tribulation period, it will be a day's wages. Now think about that. If you make $20, $30, $40 a day, and it takes that much for a loaf of bread, that's hard, isn't it? So the idea is that there will be abject poverty, and there has been abject poverty. Becoming a Christian often meant loss of jobs, homes, possessions, and social status. Property was confiscated by the emperors as a regular practice. If they had a Christian, like some of the ones that we read about in Acts that donated property, sold property, and things like that, if they were well-to-do, the emperors would go after them first because they had stuff and they could seize it and keep it. So this great poverty was coming upon them because they were being persecuted. But notice what Christ says here in our verse. It says, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. But notice the quotations here. But thou art rich. I want you to see that. Thou art rich. Sure, we may be poor physically, but we're blessed in abundant ways of grace and mercy in our salvation. Not only that, is during this time, if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, you'll see where these saints made great stands for the gospel. They were persecuted. And they were used as targets. They were used in the arena for sport. They were turned over to lions just to be mangled and eaten by lions. They would have a farmer come in with a sword in his hand to defend his family from professional gladiators. Those kind of things they were made sport of. So they were naked, they were destitute, they lived in caves and rocks and places that would be hard to get to. But notice what Jesus says, thou art rich. Now we know that possessions here on this earth aren't a sign of status, as people think. The possessions here on this earth are blessings for us. If we have any, that's God blessing us. But what if those things are gone? Can you make it without it? Yes. How? By the riches of Christ. By His grace, by His mercy, by His blessings. Now, if you try to make it on your own, won't work. But Christ always looks out for his people and his church. All right, so becoming a Christian meant the loss of jobs, but Christ says, thou art rich. James said it also in James 2:5. Write that reference down, James 2:5. Hearken, my beloved brethren, has not God chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which hath promised to them, which he hath promised to them that love him? In other words, sure, they may be poor here, but what do they have in eternity? Everything. Are they not heirs and joint heirs with Christ? Yes. So they own this whole universe already. Sure, they might not have a pot to cook their meal in, but they're rich in many different ways. So Paul also says, write this one down, 2 Corinthians 6:10. As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. As poor, yet making many rich. As having nothing, and yet possessing all things. 2 Corinthians 6:10. It would seem that their persecutors were not just pagans, though, not just the Romans, but the Jews helped. Remember Paul? Anybody remember Saul? What was he doing? He was helping these guys. He was supposedly helping the Jews, but he was also helping the Roman emperors do this persecution. All right, so now we see that it was not just the pagans, not just the Jews, but it was the devil pushing these emperors. Now remember, most of these emperors believed that they were gods, okay, with a little g. They believed that they were gods and that they could do no wrong. Whatever they did was fine. They were the gods. And they demanded that Christians give up the true and the living God and claim him to be God, the emperor, and offer sacrifices unto him. Now, it was the only way they'd let you out of the murderous intent that they had for you was if you gave up and swore an allegiance to Caesar and that you offered up him sacrifices as God. We see that also in Catholic history. Anybody ever heard of the Dark Ages? Anybody ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition? What was going on with that? Well, the Pope decided he wanted to get rid of heretics and Jews. And he put out an edict that said anybody that does not confess the Pope as the vicar on earth, he will be tormented and executed unless he recants as a heretic. And during that time, anybody ever heard of the Iron Maiden? That torture device, the rack where they'd stretch you, drawing and quartering, all those tortures were developed during this time to kill those who would not convert to Catholicism and name the Pope as their Christ on earth. You see, that's the same method that these emperors used. It's the same thinking, the same idea that they want to be gods and they're going to take over and they don't care who they have to kill to do it. All right, so these were Jews as well. We see that by evidence of Paul. These Smyrna Christians found very few friends in this hostile world. Their present persecution was only the forerunner of that which was to come. Christ predicted that the devil would cast some of them in prison, doing all he could in his power to stop their testimony in the midst of his domain. Even Saul, who became Paul, was doing exactly that. He's putting them in prison for naming the name of Christ. Christ predicted that the devil would do this. Christ indicated that they would be tried and have tribulation 10 days. Now, how does that sound? 10 days, 10 emperors. See the connection there? 10 days and 10 emperors. Scholars have pondered these 10 days. If the church is taken as a representative church in the persecution in the 2nd and 3rd century, 10 days can be representative of this period of time. All right? A question comes up in your mind, that is, we know that the ungodly will suffer, but why Christians? Why are Christians have to suffer? Well, if you stop and think about it, Jesus tells us often, and the Bible tells us often, that we have to be tried to made what? To be made what? Pure. The dross has to be removed from off of us. The impurities, the imperfections, the weaknesses, those are all drawn up. And how does God do that? Well, there are many and sundry ways that God does that. Through the persecution and trials of the furnace of affliction, God removes our weaknesses, infirmities, and sins. So the idea there, the furnace, though, shows us it's not pleasant. How many of y'all want to jump in the furnace? But God knows how to put us in a furnace of affliction. We know that the will of God is holy, pure, just, and good, and that sometimes Christian suffering comes as a result of discipline. In other words, if we do wrong, guess what? We're going to be punished. We all think that we're these wild sheep that can do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, and get away with it. Got news for you. If you're a wild sheep, you're in trouble. You're not in the church. What's going to get you? What's outside of the shepherd's watch? The wolves, the lions, and the bears. They're going to eat you. So the idea here is that you will suffer persecution in this world, but God sometimes has to punish us for disciplinary matters. But there are other times when it's not God punish us, He's allow us to suffer so that we can learn and grow more sanctified, more holy, so that when He comes, He won't have to do any refining whatsoever. He's ready to receive us unto Himself. Now, there's a promise on your outline, the promise to overcomers. Let's read the verse. It says, "Fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. What's it say? Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." A crown of life. This is the martyr's crown, or the crown of life. Now, there are 5 crowns named in the Bible. You want to write them down? I'll give them to you. The crown of life, the crown of righteousness, the crown of glory, the crown of gold, and the crown of rejoicing. I got one more. The incorruptible crown. The incorruptible crown. So you got the crown of life, the crown of righteousness, the crown of glory, the crown of gold, and the crown of rejoicing, and the incorruptible crown. All right, what is a crown a symbol of?
Kingship.
All right, or royalty. Okay, authority, royalty. Okay, so it's also a symbol of victory. To the victors go the spoil. Remember when a Olympian in the old days would win the race or whatever contest it was, what would they do? They would crown him with a wreath of laurel, symbolizing he was the king of that sport. Okay? Now it's a gold medal around your neck. Crowns are symbols of royalty and symbols of victory. The man of the world lives but to die. The Christian dies only to live. As Christ says later about our works being tested by the fire, the work of these Christians came out refined, pure, holy, and profitable. What they accomplished through their stand was the furtherance of the gospel, the bringing of the gospel down through the ages, the steadfastness and determination and the courage that they would have to face their persecutors and not recant. It became so popular, if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, it became so popular that when they began persecuting them, everybody was amazed at the grace that they had during their death. We mentioned Polycarp last week. Polycarp said, well, let me pray one more hour and then I'll be ready to go. And then they were going to tie him up on that stake and get ready to burn him. He said, you ain't got to tie me, I'll stand here. And he stood right there and let them burn him. Isn't that something? And he prayed for them. They asked him to recant. He refused to recant. He was an old man when they did that. So they were trying their best to get the church stamped out. But the more they stamped, the more that God brought the church through. So remember, persecution doesn't mean God's trying to kill you. Somebody may be trying to kill you, but God is using it for our good, for the furtherance of his gospel and his plan. And when we see that persecution begin again, know that the last days are here. And if you stop and think about it, look at in Africa right now, what are they doing to Christians? Look at China, what are they doing to Christians? Look in Iraq and Iran and those countries, what are they doing to Christians? They're persecuting them. So there's a warning right there. Hey, look, time is getting short. There's no prophecy lacking except for the sounding of the trumpet and the Lord stepping out in the clouds. Israel has become a nation. Remember, it says that those things shall not pass. Those things shall not pass before the coming of the Son of Man. Remember that generation, which was together in 1948, shall not pass away before Christ returns. Well, how old is that generation now if they were born in 1948?
Up there, 80-something.
Right at 80-something. So that's over and above their life expectancy. So what does that tell you about the time the Lord's going to return? It's closer, closer and closer. What are we to do? We're to be prepared. If we have to suffer, then let us suffer with grace. Let us suffer with determination to glorify God. If we do so, there are rewards. We're not doing it for rewards, but there are rewards for our faithfulness to the Lord. Yes, the Lord will give us rewards, but that doesn't matter. What matters is standing for him and his glory and his honor. And God will honor that stand. All right, so think about that, and we'll stop there. And the next time we'll take up with the next church, which is Pergamos. Pergamos. All right, let's all stand. We'll close with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Brother Aaron.